Imagine for a second if the police, government, the state, and laws didn't exist. What would we do if we didn't have a formal society? What if we didn't have government or politics? What would hold us together? Basically, the idea of a state of nature asks us to think about these very questions. It also asks us to think about why we let ourselves be governed. These might seem like odd questions, but philosophers have long been concerned with trying to understand them. Key to this is the concept of a social contract. This is kind of like a hypothetical agreement between subjects or citizens and an authority or a ruler. So it's not as if we sign a piece of paper or anything like that, but rather we kind of form a contract among ourselves to maintain order. Different philosophers have different perspectives on what would happen in a state of nature. Let's talk about three major philosophers who wrote about the idea of a state of nature. Thomas Hobbes, born in 1588, is an English philosopher and key figure in modern Western political philosophy. His school of thought basically asks the question, what should the relationship between a person and society look like? Hobbes was interested in what would happen to order in our world if society didn't exist. For him, it would be a lot like total chaos. Hobbes believed that the world was kind of like every man for himself, and if we didn't have society holding things together, then our world would descend into intense violence and competition over resources. Hobbes wasn't very optimistic about people. He believed that we really needed society to keep us from falling into this chaos. Imagine yourself in this state of nature. You might be fighting with your fellow citizens over food at the grocery store during a terrible storm, doing everything you can to protect your own right to survival because you know there isn't enough food for everyone. Stealing would be rampant. Hobbes believed that the state of nature was a state of freedom and equality, but he meant this in a very particular way. Hobbes believed that resources were scarce and that humans were in constant competition with one another. Scarcity would cause us to fight only for our own survival. Because of this, we'd never work together to create any kind of harmony. Basically, Hobbes thought the state of nature may as well be war. He even called the state of nature bellum omnium contra omnes, or the war of all against all. John Locke, born in 1632, is another philosopher who was concerned with what the state of nature might be. Locke also thought the state of nature was a state of equality and freedom, but in a much different way than Hobbes. Locke figured that equality isn't a right to do anything we want, but rather no one has a right to hold power over anyone else. We can go after our self-interest, but there are some limits. Locke called this the law of nature, which means that no one has the right to harm another person. And as long as it doesn't hurt us, we should also try to help people. Unlike Hobbes, he didn't believe in scarcity. In Locke's scenario, there'd be enough food for everyone at the grocery store. You'd look out for your interests, but you wouldn't hoard food so others couldn't have any. Locke was invested in the idea of private property. In fact, he believed that the ruler's ultimate job was to protect individuals' private property. Locke felt that people didn't need to obey a sovereign or ruler if he wasn't protecting our right to private property. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in 1712, was a philosopher who dedicated much of his writings to understanding how we can have both individual freedom and a kind of governing body, such as a state. Rousseau believed that individuals needed to work together in some ways to get the things we need. This is where the state arises. But Rousseau didn't believe this was all good. In fact, he saw the state as potentially only serving the interests of the wealthy. But, Rousseau thought, people might consent to it in an effort to avoid the scary, warlike state of nature that Hobbes feared. Rousseau thought a social contract could be a solution to this. He believed that general will, or the collective will of all people in a society, could come together and provide the law. Rousseau believed that when this happened, we could have both individual freedom and protection from being ruled or subordinated by other individuals. In Rousseau's formulation, we give up some of our individual freedoms, but gain a sense of civic responsibility to one another, and the collective will that ultimately shapes the law. Imagine yourself back at the grocery store. Rousseau believed that we're born inclined to share the food and make sure everyone has enough supplies to make it through the storm. But it's possible for society to corrupt us into making selfish decisions. So, for Rousseau, it's not people, but society that can be the problem. This is why we need to work to develop our collective will, hopefully in a positive way. If you've wondered what life would be like without society, you're in good company. Some of the most well-known philosophers have pondered this question. In philosophy, the idea of a state of nature is an effort to try and understand what humans would be like without any government or society, and considers why we let ourselves be governed. Thomas Hobbes believed that the state of nature would result in total chaos, because humans are always competing for scarce resources. The state of nature would resemble an every man for himself kind of scenario. To avoid descending into total chaos, Hobbes believed we need to enter into some kind of social contract, a hypothetical agreement between subjects or citizens and an authority or a ruler. John Locke was slightly more optimistic. He believed that we have an obligation to try to help others and refrain from hurting others, as long as it doesn't interfere with our own freedom. This is known as the law of nature. According to Locke, protecting the private property of individuals is the most important role of the ruler. Jean-Jacques Rousseau considered us all to be good and virtuous in the state of nature. He sought to figure out how we can have both individual freedom and be governed or ruled. He believed that the general will, or the collective will of all the people in society, would come together and provide the law. This would ensure both protection and individual freedom.